all up and ready for a day in Boston. Though I'm speaking about topics that are a few days ahead of us, but I would hope that you have had some experience in Canada, and maybe you've been to some of these, what we call the Maritime provinces. So I called my talk today the Coast of Opportunity, because this is the first part of North America that was reached by, first of all, the Portuguese and the Basque as fishermen, and then the French and then the English came, and the first of their overseas colonies was in this region, and the battle ensued after that. So that for many Canadians and Americans, this early history sort of set the tenor for the development of these vast lands. And as the islands were settled and the coastland of maritime Canada became known, then more colonists came in and continued to explore and settle all the way across, of course, the continent. And so we're going to be visiting some very small places in a sense. I mean, Halifax is our next stop, which is a fair-sized city, but we'll be going past other islands that have not much population because of the weather, because of the economy, and even to this day, the Maritimes are not the center of the Canadian economy, because many of the industries, and particularly a lot of the education and the youth, move into the bigger cities and out into the larger continent. But this was the region where Canada began, and it has a number of islands, and first of all, the great St. Lawrence Bay and River is what it's based around, so that this bay, which is in its inner part kind of an estuary, it has the St. Lawrence River coming out and a lot of other drainage from the north of Quebec, Labrador, Nova Scotia is down on the bottom, but this Gulf of St. Lawrence and along with the river is very ecologically rich, and that's why it was also part of the great cod industry. I described yesterday how the ocean currents make for particular conditions here, especially with the Gulf Stream coming up from the Caribbean with warm water, and then it meets with the Labrador currents, which are coming out of the Arctic down the Labrador, Greenland coast, and then they mix around Newfoundland, come out into the Grand Banks. Much of the year, this creates a tremendous sea fog, and so this is an area with a great deal of turbulence in the water, upwelling of minerals in the ocean floor, which is why the codfish were so abundant right in this area, particularly in the shallow banks. That is the Grand Banks. George's Bank is off the screen to the left, and then there's what's called the Flemish Cap. If anybody saw that film, The Perfect Storm, that was a good rendition of how rough it can get out here. And of course, thousands of sailors lost their lives out there chasing the great king cod. Now this region, as I said again, is the mixing of the waters. This is an illustration of the photoplankton that is coming to bloom in the summertime, all in the bays, Gulf of Maine, all the way down the coast and up off of Nova Scotia and into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that is why this area had so much fish versus out further in the ocean. It did not have that kind of ecosystem and food chain. So here again, this is actually temperature charts, and the swirling of the waters is monitored from a satellite. But you see Nova Scotia in the center and Cape Breton Island. This is Prince Edward Island, Anacostia Island up toward Quebec. Gaspé will be going there. And then Newfoundland, the biggest of the islands with its unusual shape. This island of Newfoundland, which was the first island that was found by Europeans, particularly they have found Viking settlements on the north end of it, and other evidence of Vikings have been searched in all these islands, but it was Jacques Cartier and then John Cabot who were the first European explorers that documented and drew maps of this area, though prior to that many others had come just for the fishing alone from Europe. But this particular illustration shows you that the hatching is actually the great fishery area, which, as I said, now has been closed for about a decade just to try to have it recoup the stocks. But this illustration had the purple are actually runoff pollution from mining and other industrial sources, and then the orange is mostly city and urban wash off into the waters. And note down on the lower right-hand side, there are 2 nuclear dumping grounds that are also closed, but back up into the 1970s, power plants and other government organizations, they had designated sites where they dropped canisters of radioactive material. And that's true also off the coast of the British Isles and France. So that's one of the legacies of our modern era. There are dead spots in the ocean from nuclear waste dumps, which is now not allowed by international law. But that's just a note, it's far off sea. And so up till just recently, you had all these communities from Nova Scotia, actually Gloucester, Mass, all the way up to Labrador were after king cod, and that was the major industry for maybe half of the economy, depending on where it was, particularly Newfoundland, which has very little agriculture, but the fishing was the best up there. So you have many little communities that depended on this. Then the big ocean trawlers came in and began to sweep the sea out in international waters, particularly the Russian, Spanish, even Japanese fleets would come up and come right up into the permitted limit and just take everything. So that is still the case out, but most of the best fishing was toward the coastal waters, and now it has been completely restricted by the Canadian. There's still a remnant fishing out of Massachusetts, but the drop has dropped to a fraction of what it was 50 years ago. Well, this is maybe will revive. Somebody was asking me, how long does it take for a fishery to restore itself? Well, they estimate there's about 1% of the original stock that is still in the ocean of the cod. And I talked the other day that to try to farm cod has been proved impossible because unlike salmon, they don't get along very well. They will eat each other. And so they, as a cannibalistic fish, they can't be kept in a pen. And typically they run on the bottom of the seabed as sort of an eating machine. They will eat anything they come across. They're an omnivore, including a carnivore, cannibalistic fish. And so they are constantly swimming, and the ones that can't keep up get eaten by the ones behind them. So it sort of reminds me of traffic in New York City, but there's very little of it now. But back in the centuries when this was the largest fishery in the whole world, it was salted and dried. And now this is where we get the word bacalhau, which was the Portuguese version of salt cod from this great fishery here, where they would put racks up and they would dry it. They catch it all summer, dry it up, and by this time of year they would send it back to Europe, and it became the cheap protein for the population of Europe. Now you get a remnant catch of cod. Often it's coming from the Arctic, though. And it was on the menu last night in the restaurant. If you had it, it tasted deliciously in danger. But I figure it was caught. Someone should have it. But usually you get salt cod, which is so salty you have to wash the meat. If you've ever made a bacalhau or those things, it's now it's a specialty dish. But it used to be sent over by shiploads, and this is an illustration of the remnant of the Basque communities that would sail from Galicia, Spain, or the Portuguese also came over, and they would set up camps and they go shore fishing and then dry the fish. And so they have remnant communities all through the area, including the word labrador is actually Portuguese for the work or the worker. And so that's the province of Canada that carries on that heritage of Basque and Portuguese names. And there are these other names for these places that have now faded into history between the English and the French coming in. Just off of Halifax, well, not close, 150 sea miles, is this island called Sable Island, which is a sand spit that has risen up above the surface. It's about 20 miles long, and it is essentially sort of a giant beach. Oh, I think we're rumbling into the harbor of Boston now, so I'll be quick. But Sable Isle is famous for all of its shipwrecks. Some over 200 major vessels coming in and out of this region would go up onto the beach, and so there was famous marooning of people in the winter storms, and many people died on this sandy beach. And now it is a preserve, a historic preserve, and a sort of one of the graveyards of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, this is Nova Scotia. Now we're on our way there all of tomorrow, and Halifax is in the harbor right there. This is a rather large piece of land that is its own province. It was originally called by the French Arcadia, and I'll go into how that changed. But you have Prince Edward Island is up on the top, Cape Breton Island to the right, New Brunswick is to the left, and then the great, let's say, limb of Nova Scotia. And this Cape Race down on the very bottom left side is also a very dangerous place for shipping, particularly in the fog. Now today's pretty clear. We have a sort of enduring summer conditions here, but by soon it'll be all fogged up and very difficult in the days before the holy GPS. Well, here's Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia, and I believe there's an excursion there. So this is the rocky, scenic coast. That's not unlike Maine, but it's even more exposed to the larger Atlantic Ocean and the swell, so it's a more dramatic coast than you get in, at least for the waters, than you get in neighboring Maine. And so a lot of Nova Scotia is a fairly modest place, I'd say. Other than the city of Halifax, it's all small towns, a lot of farms, some I call pine scruff forests and wildlife, moose, things like this on the interior. But the population is only about 2 million in the entire large province. Now, Nova Scotia itself is as big as all of the New England states of the United States. So you get up there and it's very expansive, and the settlements are far and few between, and of course, even more so, you go further north. The boreal, what they call the Great Eastern Forest, and the Northern Forest, they call it in Maine, is this scruff pine with some deciduous trees. You do get the fall foliage, but none of the timber is very large. It had been before it was all cut for shipbuilding, but now it is regrowth, and none of it is as majestic, let's say, as you get out on the Pacific coast. But here's Cape Breton Island, which is a much contested place, I call, because it was named by the French after Brittany, or Bretagne. And it was settled by the French first after all the fishing communities had been already there. And they held Cape Breton with the great fortress at Louisbourg, which is down on the lower right-hand side. It's right there on the tip of Cape Breton Island. But this is a very rugged island, mostly cliffs, rolling hills, rough seashore, but very scenic. And the French built their major fort there so that they could hold the entrance to the St. Lawrence. It has a very good harbor, and so the French Navy could stay there, and then they built their massive fort, which I'll show you. But one of the unusual things about Cape Breton is this great lake in the middle. You see all of that water. That's actually salt water lake, or we call it a sea lake, because it has a gap into it and out of it in two places, and even though it's all salt water from the ocean, it has tide, it is effectively a lake. So that became a shelter for shipping on their way back from Europe, because if there was really terrible weather, they could go into the little gaps that are not clear on this map, and then to this day it's a very lovely, calm water that larger ships can get into. Cape Breton itself is only reached on land by this bridge, so it is effectively it is cut off from the rest of Nova Scotia. It had been its own province for a while. Now it's its own county as part of Nova Scotia. But you go over this, you can see the landscape sort of at this time of year. It's full of colors, and then there's a lot of farm, and it was settled by French farmers. Then later, English and particularly Scottish came over. It does feel a lot like Scotland up here with the, particularly the culture is, these are local flags in Cape Breton, which have the colors and sort of the tartan there. And if you go to the little towns, there's always a bagpiper and a Scottish-style culture in these little communities. Again, the population is not very large. I have some friends who have summer homes up there, and I was up there years and years ago, and the area of Cape Breton is particularly known for its music festivals, its fiddling, its singing, and again, Scottish-Canadian culture. The French were driven out. Now, this is a story that I'll get to here, but a lot of the settlements were originally French, and then there was a mass expulsion of the French settlers after the British took Fort Louisbourg. The current economy, though, is much of it is mining. There's a significant deposit, so that's one of the major activities. It's iron ore, then also some gypsum. They load onto the ships right there on the cliffs and then take it to the refineries or the processing other places. But that's part of the economy, sort of chewing at the hills, and there are plenty of them. I mean, this is not major mining compared to other places in Canada, but it's still a significant part of the economy on Cape Breton. Well, this is the Bras d'Or, and that's the French name, which means the arm of gold, literally. And it has all these hills surrounding this, very, very peaceful lake. But it was the favorite for ocean yachtsmen who would keep, and to this day, keep their boats up there in Bras d'Or, and then it's a calm harbor. Then if they want to go out to sea, they can go out or stop on their way wherever they are. Famously, Alexander Graham Bell had his summer home up here, which is now a historic preserve. And so around this lake, it is still considered, let's say, exclusive property just because of the nature and the calmness of this lake. We will not go in there. We will also not stop at the major port, which is Sydney, which is the mining export center, and also what population is living around Sydney. But sometimes we do stop there. This happens to be the first synagogue in all of Canada, which is in Sydney, which just shows how many people came from how far to come and make a new life in North America. But of course, there were other people here for 5,000 or 10,000 years. They're still doing the archaeology to find out when the native peoples came all the way across the continent or wherever they came from. That's still a debate, and settled all these islands. Now, they were a hunting and gathering and fishing people. This is called the Micmac, of which there are many different groups that spread through this area. There's some related in the state of Maine. But they were the first contact, along with their cousins in Newfoundland, which are called the Beothuk. And they still remain here. This is one of their wigwams, they call that. It's not really a teepee, it's more, but this is a nomadic style of habitation. And they would travel between the inland areas in the winter to hunt the moose, and then they go down to the shore to collect shells. And they actually caught lobsters and kept them in big pens. And so they were very healthy and well-fed people just because of the bounty of this region, if you knew what to do, and you had, of course, shelter in the winter. So when the English, Portuguese, French came, they had an off and on good relations, because the Micmac knew the interior in particular, and when the beaver trade began as the major industry, they were the voyageurs, they called them, the native people who traveled up into the inland and knew where the beaver were, would trap them, come back to the shore, and sell them in the markets to the Europeans. And so for a while, the Micmac were, let's say, prospering with this contact, because then they had iron and knives and other things that helped them in their subsistence. And they began weaving elaborate cloaks and things. And so they were very dignified people, but they came into the conflict between the French and the English. In particular, the French would only give them land rights if they converted to Christianity. So they all became Catholics lest they be driven off their land. And they had a series of treaties with the French and then the English to cooperate, let's say. But they got caught when the British came in and took Nova Scotia. The Micmac were allied with the French. So many of them were killed in battle or driven to the west into New Brunswick and into the state of Maine. And it's sort of a complicated history, because the different tribes and places played off in the great French and Indian Wars. There was a lot of treachery and betrayals and then massacres, and it's a sad fate for many of the indigenous people for over a couple hundred years. But finally it settled when Canada made its first Indian Act and gave them their rights to fishing and land rights. This is the ceremony in 1879 where they were recognized as what they call now in Canada First Nation with rights ahead of all the other immigrants. They have about 25,000 official members of the nation, the Mi'kmaq, but they opened it up to anybody with a mixed ethnicity, and now they have over 100,000 pending applications to join the tribe. Who knows? You might be Mi'kmaq too if you dig out the right ancestor. And that's an issue all around North America and all around the world in Aboriginal people's survival. But this is the monument at one of their tribal headquarters for the Treaty of 1752, which was the first peace treaty with the British that had just taken Nova Scotia. And you note they have their own language. This photo isn't clear enough to know, but they continued in their own language, even though they converted to mostly Catholicism and Christianity, and then they continued to work the shore, work the woods, and work the mines, and then many of them become assimilated, and they don't have their spoken language anymore. But the Mi'kmaq were particularly famous because they played this odd game where you have a stick and you have a puck and you go hitting it on ice. I just don't understand it. But they were the originators of hockey. And up till now, they still cut what's a special wood called ironwood to make hockey sticks, even though some people have plastic ones, I've read. But no, these are the Mi'kmaqs at their hockey stick factory. And recently, the oldest hockey stick made by the Mi'kmaq in Canada from the 1850s was sold for $2 million. So that's one valuable old stick. So this is, of course, became the national sport of Canada, along with the other native sport of lacrosse. But here's an example of the Mi'kmaq hieroglyphic kind of writing. When they began to have contact with Europeans and were showed writing, they made up their own. And then with the aid of a British Army officer, they annotated, made a dictionary of the language in their own writing, which endures, but they don't use it anymore. It's all, let's say, past, and they are using Roman letters and English things these days. But they had a lot of, like most Native Americans, a lot of legends and visions and things which were annotated in this particular script. And then the nation of the Mi'kmaq has this as their flag, and it shows that they are Christian, but they are also related to the cosmos with the star and the moon. So this group is still there, and they have ceremonies. Here's a Mi'kmaq dancer, and they join on the great powwows with all the other native peoples through Canada, North America, and U.S. So though it's sort of a mixed culture now that is in some ways sort of reinvented because Native Canadians and Americans they're particularly proud, but they still feel endangered and still have a grieve of rights taken away and now slowly restored in the modern world. Well, this is just an illustration of all of the colonies. This is actually out of Winston Churchill's book, History of the English-Speaking People, that shows the settlements all the way up the coast, Newfoundland being the first, actually, 1536, and then all the way down to Plymouth, 1600s, all the way down to Georgia and Virginia. But you can appreciate that the land was just so vast that all the settlements were on the coast. The Appalachian Mountains at that time were a great barrier. The St. Lawrence River provided the access easily for ships and travel into the Great Lakes. You see the top of it, Rupert's Land, that was all under charter from Britain for the Hudson Bay Company, which continues to this day. Not as a landowner, but as the great mercantile enterprise for Canada. And so Acadia, there it is, that was the holdout of the French. And the conflict came to a head in 1745 when the British came and blockaded the port of the fortress of Louisbourg, which this is more the nautical chart. Here is the actual fortress itself by the French with batteries and protection, but it's out on a peninsula they thought would be unassailable from land, and then and by sea it was well protected. Now this was the event that led to the British control of British North America versus the French. And it was just another example of the conflicts, of course, on the continent and around the world at the time. But here's a model of Fort Louisbourg, which is now a National Park of Canada, has been restored, and is a educational display on the hills around the Great Harbor. This is the illustration when the Royal Navy sailed in to say hello. And at the time, the forces of Britain were over 4,000 troops and sailors, a few hundred ships of all sizes, and then the French only had about 900 soldiers in the fort, had some Micmac militia outside of it, but the British came and bottled up the fort and starved it in a long siege, which led to the final surrender. Many of the troops that came with the Royal Navy, though, came from Maine and Massachusetts, even far as Maryland. So this was a key military assault by the colonies, the British colonies all the way down the East Coast, to come and get the French out of that area of Acadia, Nova Scotia now, and then make sure that the empire extended from one end of the continent up here to the other. But ironically, many of the young soldiers from the colonies years later became officers in the Revolutionary War and used that training against the British forces a generation later. Well, here's the final attack and destruction of the French ships, and they were all starved out essentially, and they gave finally not much resistance. They were all imprisoned, and the fort was taken by the British. So, but it remains to this day. It was ransacked somewhat, but actually much of the structures remain, and so you can go there if you stay in Cape Breton. It's one of the great sights to see because the fort has been restored to its original gloire, and with its French-style constructions. They have reenactors and whole educational system there, and you can have a little hardtack with your red wine if you like to know what it's like to be under siege at that time. But it's actually a beautiful place with full restoration of the facilities at the time, including the chapel. So that's another visit we don't get to do because we don't stop there on the way. I just show it to you like a lot of things so that you can have a background to where we are. Now, we're also not going to New Brunswick. This is the province that is just to the west of Nova Scotia. It was the first of the first four provinces of the Confederation of Canada in 1867. But it was settled very early in the early 1600s. Again, it was French territory that was, after the fall of Louisbourg, many British settlers came in and took this as an area of great lush land. It has a very medieval flag, but it is a province about the size of Maine, and of course you see it borders with Maine, and that whole area of northeast Maine and western New Brunswick is part of one of the great deep parts of the northern forest, or the Great Eastern Forest it's referred to. And then it has all these rivers that go down to the sea, and then many little ports, and this of course is you see the Gulf of Fundy. I talked about that yesterday with the great ocean tides that come up into the Narrows. But otherwise it's mostly agricultural, forestry, again some mining, and a lot of little communities up these little rivers everywhere. On the north end it is Caraquet is a fishing port, and all that Northumberland Strait and on the edges of Prince Edward Island are famous for their shellfish. If you ever get PEI mussels and oysters, and the very fecund sea life there. Capital is at Moncton, and then there's Saint Jean. Frederick is another small city, but New Brunswick is mostly English speaking. With some Micmac and also with some French that remain there. So it's a mixed community in the various different parts of it. This is their crest, which is curiously, the stags have the French and the British symbol, and the motto means hope renewed, which is not optimistic. But I like the fish wearing a crown, a royal cod. Anyway, that, and there, as in the rest of Canada, you get bilingual. You must have everything written in French and English. But it depends on where you are. You will get one or the other. So I'll pause to tell you a story about a lakeside in New Brunswick where, or the seaside, and there's a kid out swimming and foundering in the water, and the lifeguard stands up and looks around, and the adults on the shore look out, and then the lifeguard doesn't move. So somebody goes out and drags the kid in and goes up to the lifeguard and said, "Did you see that kid that needed your help?" "Yes, I did. But why didn't you save that child?" And the lifeguard said, "Well, I don't swim that well." And then the man said, "Well, how did you ever get a job as a lifeguard?" And he said, "Maybe je parle français aussi. I speak French." I'm sorry, I hope no Canadians take offense to that, but that's a local joke. Well, anyway, a lot of this coast is very rugged and very dramatic. If you get around, like, say, Cape Enrage, I don't know who got angry there. Then there are all these rivers, and then the Great Bay of Fundy. So it's fairly dramatic land. Most Americans from the South never go there except on their way to Nova Scotia or on their way to Quebec, but in itself it has a lot of dramatic seascapes, especially. I showed you pictures of the great rocks at the top of the Bay of Fundy. But it's not quite the Rocky Mountains, but it does get mountainous. If you know the state of Maine, it's very similar to that, but with more agriculture and settlement, and a lot of parks and natural reserves now. Again, we're not going there. I just show this to you just so you get a taste of the variety that we are near, if not going to stop and see. So it has still a lot of that kind of deep forest quality that you get in Maine, where people go in and get lost and there's no roads and such. But the border of Maine and New Brunswick is unfenced, and it's just the next side of the road. So it's one of the great border without any guard or fence. This is not a border. This is a walkway through one of the tidal salt marshes as part of an ecological reserve near Moncton. But that's quite a bridge construction to see a few pieces of mud. Here in another part of New Brunswick is the world's largest covered bridge. And you may be familiar with them in Vermont and other places, but this one is particularly long. And the reason why they would cover the bridge is so that they could get across in the winter, so the bridge wouldn't have 10 feet of snow on it. So this is an example of the adaptation of people